Chapter 4. Fuck off, Google. Section 1. There are no Facebook revolutions, but there is a new science of government, cybernetics. The genealogy is not well known, and it deserves to be. Twitter descends from a program named TextMob, invented by American activists as a way to coordinate via cell phones during protests against the Republican National Convention in 2004. The application was used by some 5,000 people to share real-time information about the different actions and movements of the police. Twitter, launched 2 years later, was used for similar purposes. In Moldova, for example, and the Iranian demonstrations of 2009 popularized the idea that it was the tool for coordinating insurgents, particularly against dictatorships. In 2011, when rioting reached an England thought to be definitively impassive, some journalists were sure that tweeting had helped spread the disturbances from their epicenter, Tottenham. Logical, but it turned out that for their communication needs, the rioters had gone with BlackBerry, whose secure telephones had been designed for the upper management of banks and multinationals, and the British Secret Service didn't even have the decryption keys for them. Moreover, a group of hackers hacked into BlackBerry's site to dissuade the company from cooperating with the police in the aftermath. If Twitter enabled a self-organization on this occasion, it was more that of the citizen sweepers who volunteered to sweep up and repair the damage caused by the confrontations and looting. That effort was relayed and coordinated by Crisis Commons, a, quote, global network of volunteers working together to build and use technology tools to help respond to disasters and improve resiliency and response before a crisis. At the time, a French left-wing rag compared this undertaking to the organization of the Puerta del Sol during the Indignance movement, as it's called. The comparison between a scheme aimed at a quick return to order and the fact of several thousand people organizing to live on an occupied plaza in the face of repeated assaults by the police may look absurd, unless we see in them just two spontaneous, connected, civil gestures. From 15M on, the Spanish indignados, a good number of them at least, called attention to their faith in a citizen's utopia. For them, the digital social networks had not only accelerated the spread of the 2011 movement, but also, and more importantly, had set the terms of a new type of political organization for the struggle and for society. A connected, participatory, transparent democracy. It's bound to be upsetting for, quote, revolutionaries to share such an idea with Jared Cohen, the American government's anti-terrorism advisor who contacted Twitter during the, quote, Iranian Revolution of 2009 and urged them to maintain its functioning despite censorship. Jared Cohen has recently co-written with Google's former CEO, Eric Schmidt, a creepy political book, The New Digital Age. On its first page, one reads this sentence meant to maintain the confusion about the political virtues of the new communication technologies. Quote, the internet is the largest experiment involving anarchy in history. In Tripoli, Tottenham, or Wall Street, people have been protesting failed policies and the meager possibilities afforded by the electoral system. They have lost faith in government and other centralized institutions of power. There is no viable justification for a democratic system in which public participation is limited to voting. We live in a world in which ordinary people write Wikipedia, get online to help organize a protest in cyberspace and in the physical world, such as the revolutions in Egypt or Tunisia, or the demonstrations of the indignados throughout Spain, or pore over the cables revealed by WikiLeaks. The same technologies enabling us to work together at a distance are creating the expectation to do better at governing ourselves, end quote. This is not an indignata speaking, or if so, she's one who camped for a long time in an office of the White House. Beth Novak directed the, quote, Open Government Initiative of the Obama administration. That program starts from the premise that the governmental function should consist in linking up citizens and making available information that's now held inside the bureaucratic machine. Thus, according to New York City Hall, quote, "The hierarchical structure based on the notion that the government knows what's good for you is outdated. The new model for this century depends on co-creation and collaboration," end quote. Unsurprisingly, the concept of open government data was formulated not by politicians but by computer programmers, fervent defenders of open-source software development, moreover, who invoked the U.S.'s founding fathers' conviction that every citizen should take part in government. Here, the government is reduced to the role of team player or facilitator, ultimately to that of a platform for coordinating citizen action. The parallel with social networks is fully embraced. How can the city think of itself in the same way Facebook has an API system or Twitter does? Is the question on their minds at the New York mayor's office. This can enable us to produce a more user-centric experience of government. It's not just the consumption, but the co-production of government services and democracy. Even if these declarations are seen as fanciful cogitations, as products of the somewhat overheated brains of Silicon Valley, they still confirm that the practice of government is less and less identified with state sovereignty. In the era of networks, governing means ensuring the interconnection of people, objects, and machines, as well as the free, i.e. transparent and controllable, circulation of information that is generated in this manner. Section 2. A curse on all things smart. In the 1980s, Terry Winograd, the mentor of Larry Page, one of the founders of Google, and Fernando Flores, the former finance minister of Salvador Allende, wrote concerning design in information technology that, quote, "The most important designing is ontological. It constitutes an intervention in the background of our heritage, growing out of our already existent ways of being in the world and deeply affecting the kinds of beings that we are. It is necessarily reflective and political." The same can be said of cybernetics. Officially, we continue to be governed by the old dualistic Western paradigm where there is the subject and the world, the individual and society, men and machines, the mind and the body, the living and the non-living. These are distinctions that are still generally taken to be valid. In reality, cybernetized capitalism does practice an ontology, and hence an anthropology, whose key elements are reserved for its initiates. The rational Western subject, mindful of his interests, aspiring to master the world and governable thereby, gives way to the cybernetic conception of a being without an interiority, of a selfless self, an emergent, climactic being, constituted by its exteriority, by its relations. A being which, armed with its Apple Watch, comes to understand itself entirely on the basis of external data, the statistics that each of its behaviors generates. A quantified self, that is, will monitor, measure, and desperately optimize every one of its gestures and each of its affects. For the most advanced cybernetics, there's already no longer man and his environment, but a system being, which is itself part of an ensemble of complex information systems, hubs of autonomic processes. A being that can be better explained by starting from the middle way of Indian Buddhism than from Descartes. Quote, "For man, being alive means the same thing as participating in a broad global system of communication," asserted Wiener in 1948. Just as political economy produced a homo economicus manageable in the framework of industrial states, cybernetics is producing its own humanity, a transparent humanity emptied out by the very flows that traverse it, electrified by information, attached to the world by an ever-growing quantity of apparatuses, a humanity that's inseparable from its technological environment because it is constituted and thus driven by that. Such is the object of government now, no longer man or his interests, but his social environment, an environment whose model is the smart city, Smart because by means of its sensors it produces information whose processing in real time makes self-management possible. And smart because it produces and is produced by smart inhabitants. Political economy reigned over beings by leaving them free to pursue their interest. Cybernetics controls them by leaving them free to communicate. We need to reinvent the social systems in a controlled framework, some MIT professor declared recently. The most petrifying and most realistic vision of the metropolis to come is not found in the brochures that IBM distributes to municipalities to sell them software for managing the flows of water, electricity, or road traffic. It's rather the one developed in principle against that Orwellian vision of the city. Smarter cities, co-produced by the residents themselves, in any case by the best connected among them. Another MIT professor traveling in Catalonia is pleased to see its capital becoming little by little a fab city. Sitting here, right in the heart of Barcelona, I see a new city being invented where everyone will have access to the tools to make it completely autonomous. The citizens are thus no longer subalterns but smart people, quote, receivers and generators of ideas, services, and solutions, as one of them says. In this vision, the metropolis doesn't become smart through the decision-making and action of a central government, but appears as a spontaneous order when its inhabitants find new ways of producing, connecting, and giving meaning to their own data. The resilient metropolis thus emerges, one that can resist every disaster. Behind the futuristic promise of a world of fully linked people and objects, when cars, fridges, watches, vacuums, and dildos are directly connected to each other and to the internet, there is what is already here. The fact that the most polyvalent of sensors is already in operation. Myself. I share my geolocation, my mood, my opinions, my account of what I saw today that was awesome or awesomely banal. I ran, so I immediately shared my route, my time, my performance numbers, and their self-evaluation. I also post photos of my vacations, my evenings, my riots, my colleagues, of what I'm going to eat and who I'm going to fuck. I appear not to do much, and yet I produce a steady stream of data. Whether I work or not, my everyday life, as a stock of information, can always be mined. I am constantly improving the algorithm. Quote, thanks to the widespread network of sensors, we will have a God's eye view of ourselves. For the first time, we can precisely map the behavior of masses of people at the level of their daily lives, enthuses one of the professors. The great refrigerated storehouses of data are the pantry of current government. In its rummaging through the databases produced and continuously updated by the everyday life of connected humans, it looks for the correlations it can use to establish not universal laws nor even whys, but rather whens and whats. One-time situated predictions, not to say oracles. The stated ambition of cybernetics is to manage the unforeseeable and to govern the ungovernable instead of trying to destroy it. The question of cybernetic government is not only, as in the era of political economy, to anticipate in order to plan the action to take, but also to act directly upon the virtual, to structure the possibilities. A few years ago, the LAPD bought itself a new software program called PredPol. Based on a heap of crime statistics, it calculates the probabilities that a particular crime will be committed, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street. Given these probabilities updated in real time, the program itself organizes the police patrols in the city. A founder cybernetician wrote in Le Monde in 1948, "We can dream of a time when the machine à gouverner will, for good or evil, who knows, compensate for the shortcomings, obvious today, of the leaders and customary apparatuses of politics." End quote. Every epoch dreams the next one, even if the dream of the one may become the daily nightmare of the other. The object of the great harvest of personal information is not an individualized tracking of the whole population. If the surveillance insinuate themselves into the intimate lives of each and every person, it's not so much to construct individual files as to assemble massive databases that make numerical sense. It is more efficient to correlate the shared characteristics of individuals in a multitude of profiles with the probable developments they suggest. One is not interested in the individual, present and entire, but only in what makes it possible to determine their potential lines of flight. The advantage of applying the surveillance to profiles, events, and virtualities is that statistical entities don't take offense, and individuals can still claim they're not being monitored, at least not personally. While cybernetic governmentality already operates in terms of a completely new logic, its subjects continue to think of themselves according to the old paradigm. We believe that our personal data belongs to us, like our car or our shoes, and that we're only exercising our individual freedom by deciding to let Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, or the police have access to them, without realizing that this has immediate effects on those who refuse to, and who will be treated from then on as suspects, as potential deviants. To be sure, predicts the new digital age, there will be people who resist adopting and using technology, people who want nothing to do with virtual profiles, online data systems, or smartphones. Yet a government might suspect that people who opt out completely have something to hide and thus are more likely to break laws, and as a counter-terrorism measure, that government will build a kind of hidden people registry. If you don't have any registered social networking profiles or more mobile subscriptions, and online references to you are unusually hard to find, you might be considered a candidate for such a registry. You might also be subjected to a strict set of new regulations that includes rigorous airport screening or even travel restrictions. Section 3. The Poverty of Cybernetics. So the security services are coming to consider a Facebook profile more credible than the individual supposedly hiding behind it. This is some indication of the porousness between what was still called the virtual and the real. The accelerating datafication of the world does make it less and less pertinent to think of the online world and the real world, cyberspace and reality, as being separate. Quote, "Look at Android, Gmail, Google Maps, Google Search. That's what we do. We make products that people can't live without," is how they put it in Mountain View. Yet, in the past few years, the ubiquity of connected devices in the everyday lives of human beings has triggered some survival reflexes. Certain barkeepers decided to ban Google Glasses from their establishments, which became truly hip as a result, it should be said. Initiatives are blossoming that encourage people to disconnect occasionally, 1 day per week, for a weekend, a month, in order to take note of their dependence on technological objects and re-experience an authentic contact with reality. The attempt proves to be futile, of course. The pleasant weekend at the seashore with one's family and without the smartphones is lived primarily as an experience of disconnection. That is, as something immediately anticipating the moment of reconnection, when it will be shared on the internet. Eventually, however, with Western man's abstract relation to the world becoming objectified in a whole complex of apparatuses, a whole universe of virtual reproductions, the path towards presence paradoxically reopens. By detaching ourselves from everything, we'll end up detaching ourselves even from our detachment. The technological beatdown will ultimately restore our capacity to be moved by the bare, pixel-less existence of a honeysuckle vine. Every sort of screen coming between us and reality will have been required before we could reclaim the singular shimmer of the sensible world, and our amazement at what is there. It will have taken hundreds of friends who have nothing to do with us liking us on Facebook the better to ridicule us afterwards, for us to rediscover the ancient taste for friendship. Having failed to create computers capable of equaling human beings, they've set out to impoverish human experience to the point where life is no longer more attractive than its digital modeling. Can one picture the human desert that had to be created to make existence on the social media seem desirable? Just as the traveler had to be replaced by the tourist, for it to be imagined that the latter might pay to go all over the world via hologram while remaining in their living room. But the slightest real experience will shatter the wretchedness of this kind of illusionism. The poverty of cybernetics is what will bring it down in the end. For a hyper-individualized generation whose primary sociality has been that of social media, the Quebec student strike of 2012 was first of all a stunning revelation of the insurrectionary power of simply being together and starting to move. Evidently, this was a meetup like no other before, such that the insurgent friendships were able to rush the police lines. The control traps were useless against that. In fact, they had become another way for people to test themselves together. Quote, "The end of the self will be the genesis of presence," envisioned Giorgio Cesarano in his survival manual. The virtue of the hackers has been to base themselves on the materiality of the supposedly virtual world. In the words of a member of Telecomics, a group of hackers famous for helping the Syrians get around the state control of the internet communications, if the hacker is ahead of his time, it's because he didn't think of this tool, the internet, as a separate virtual world, but as an extension of physical reality. This is all the more obvious now that the hacker movement is extending itself outside the screens by opening hacker spaces where people can analyze, tinker with, and piece together digital software and tech objects. The expansion and networking of do-it-yourself has produced a gamut of purposes. It's a matter of fooling with things, with the street, the city, the society, life itself. Some pathological progressives have been quick to see the beginnings of a new economy in it, even a new civilization, based this time on quote-unquote sharing. Never mind that the present capitalist economy already values quote-unquote creation beyond the old industrial constraints. Managers are urged to facilitate free initiative, to encourage innovative projects, creativity, genius, even deviance. Quote, "The company of the future must protect the deviant, for it's the deviant who will innovate and who is capable of creating rationality in the unknown," they say. Today, value is not sought in the new features of a product, nor even in its desirability or its meaning, but in the experience it offers to the consumer. So why not offer that consumer the ultimate experience of going over to the other side of the creation process? From this perspective, the hacker spaces or fab labs become spaces where the projects of consumer innovators can be undertaken and new marketplaces can emerge. In San Francisco, the tech shop firm is developing a new type of fitness club where, for a yearly membership fee, quote, "one goes every week to make things, to create and develop one's projects." The fact that the American Army finances similar places under the Cyber Fast Track program of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, doesn't discredit the hacker spaces as such, any more than they're condemned to participate in yet another restructuring of the capitalist production process when they've captured in the quote-unquote maker movement, with its spaces where people working together can build and repair industrial objects or divert them from their original uses. Village construction sets, like that of open source ecology with its 50 modular machines, tractor, milling machine, cement mixer, etc., and DIY dwelling modules could also have a different destiny than serving to found a small civilization with all the modern comforts, or creating entire new economies, or a financial system, or a new governance as its current guru fantasizes. Urban farming, which is being established on building roofs or vacant industrial lots, like the 1300 community gardens of Detroit, could have other ambitions than participating in economic recovery or bolstering the resilience of disaster zones. Attacks like those conducted by anonymous LulzSec against the police, banking firms, security multinationals, or telecommunications could very well go beyond cyberspace. As a Ukrainian hacker says, when you have to attend to your life, you stop printing stuff in 3D rather quickly. You find a different plan. Section 4. Techniques against technology. The famous question concerning technology, still a blind spot for revolutionary movements, comes in here. A wit whose name can be forgotten described the French tragedy thus: a generally technophobic country dominated by a generally technophilic elite, end quote. While the observation may not apply to the country, it does apply in any case to the radical milieus. The majority of Marxists and post-Marxists supplement their atavistic inclination to hegemony with a definite attachment to technology that emancipates man. Whereas a large percentage of anarchists and post-anarchists are down with being a minority, even an oppressed minority, and adopt positions generally hostile to technology. Each tendency even has its caricature, corresponding to the negriest devotees of the cyborg, the electronic revolution by connected multitudes. There are the anti-industrials, who've turned the critique of progress and the, quote, disaster of technological civilization into a profitable literary genre on the whole, and a niche ideology where one can stay warm at least, having envisaged no revolutionary possibility whatsoever. Technophilia and technophobia form a diabolical pair joined together by a central untruth, that such a thing as the technical exists. It would be possible, apparently, to divide between what is technical and what is not in human existence. Well, no, in fact. One only has to look at the state of incompletion in which the human offspring is born, and the time it takes for it to move about in the world and to talk, to realize that its relation to the world is not given in the least, but rather the result of a whole elaboration. Since it's not due to a natural compatibility, man's relation to the world is essentially artificial, technical, to speak Greek. Each human world is a certain configuration of techniques, of culinary, architectural, musical, spiritual, informational, agricultural, erotic, martial, etc. techniques. And it's for this reason that there is no generic human essence, because there are only particular techniques, and because every technique configures a world, materializing in this way a certain relationship with the latter, a certain form of life. So one doesn't construct a form of life, one only incorporates techniques through example, exercise, or apprenticeship. This is also why our familiar world rarely appears to us as technical, because the set of artifices that structure it are already part of us. It's rather those we're not familiar with that seem to have a strange artificiality. Hence, the technical character of our world only stands out in two circumstances: invention and breakdown. It's only when we're present at a discovery or when a familiar element is lacking, or breaks, or stops functioning, that the illusion of living in a natural world gives way in the face of contrary evidence. Techniques can't be reduced to a collection of equivalent instruments in any one of which man, that generic being, could take up and use without his essence being affected. Every tool configures and embodies a particular relation with the world and influences the one who uses it. The worlds formed in this way are not equivalent, any more than the humans who inhabit them are. And by the same token, these worlds are not hierarchizable either. There is nothing that would establish some as more advanced than others. They are merely distinct, each one having its own potential and its own history. In order to hierarchize worlds, a criterion has to be introduced, an implicit criterion, making it possible to classify the different techniques. In the case of progress, this criterion is simply the quantifiable productivity of the techniques, considered apart from what each technique might involve ethically, without regard to the sensible world it engenders. This is why there is no progress but capitalist progress, and why capitalism is the uninterrupted destruction of worlds. Moreover, the fact that techniques produce worlds and forms of life doesn't mean that man's essence is production, as Marx believed. So this is what technophiles and technophobes alike fail to grasp, the ethical nature of every technique. It should be added that the nightmare of this epoch is not in its being the age of technics, but in its being the age of technology. Technology is not the consummation of technical development, but on the contrary, the expropriation of humans' different constitutive techniques. Technology is the systematizing of the most effective techniques, and consequently the leveling of the world and the relations with the world that everyone deploys. Technology is a discourse about techniques that is constantly being projected into material reality. Just as the ideology of the festival is the death of the real festival, and the ideology of the encounter is the actual impossibility of coming together, technology is the neutralization of all the particular techniques. In this sense, capitalism is essentially technological. It is the profitable organization of the most productive techniques into a system. Its cardinal figure is not the economist, but the engineer. The engineer is the specialist in techniques, and thus the chief expropriator of them, one who doesn't let himself be affected by any of them, and spreads his own absence from the world everywhere he can. He's a sad and servile figure. The solidarity between capitalism and socialism is confirmed here, in the cult of the engineer. It was engineers who drew up most of the models of the neoclassical economy like pieces of contemporary trading software. Recall in this regard that Brezhnev's claim to fame was to have been an engineer in the metallurgical industry in Ukraine. The figure of the hacker contrasts point by point with the figure of the engineer, whatever the artistic, police-directed, or entrepreneurial efforts to neutralize him may be. Whereas the engineer would capture everything that functions in such a way that everything functions better in service to the system, the hacker asks himself, how does that work? In order to find its flaws, but also to invent other uses, to experiment. Experimenting then means exploring what such and such a technique implies ethically. The hacker pulls techniques out of the technological system in order to free them. If we are slaves of technology, this is precisely because there is a whole ensemble of artifacts of our everyday existence that we take to be specifically technical, and that we will always regard simply as black boxes of which we are the innocent users. The use of computers to attack the CIA attests rather clearly that cybernetics is no more the science of computers than astronomy is the science of telescopes. Understanding how the devices around us work brings an immediate increase in power, giving us a purchase on what will then no longer appear as an environment, but as a world arranged in a certain way and one that we can shape. This is the hacker's perspective on the world. These past few years, the hacker milieu has gained some sophistication politically, managing to identify friends and enemies more clearly. Several substantial obstacles stand in the way of its becoming revolutionary, however. In 1986, Dr. Crash wrote, "Whether you know it or not, if you are a hacker, you are a revolutionary. Don't worry, you're on the right side." End quote. It's not certain that this sort of innocence is still possible. In the hacker milieu, there is an originary illusion according to which freedom of information, freedom of the internet, or freedom of the individual can be set against those who are bent on controlling them. This is a serious misunderstanding. Freedom and surveillance, freedom and the panopticon belong to the same paradigm of government. Historically, the endless expansion of control procedures is the corollary of a form of power that is realized through the freedom of individuals. Liberal government is not one that is exercised directly on the bodies of its subjects, or that expects a filial obedience from them. It's a background power which prefers to manage space and rule over interests rather than bodies. A power that oversees, monitors, and acts minimally, intervening only where the framework is threatened against that which goes too far. Only free subjects, taken en masse, are governed. Individual freedom is not something that can be brandished against the government, for it is the very mechanism on which government depends, the one it regulates as closely as possible in order to obtain, from the amalgamation of all these freedoms, the anticipated mass effect. Ordo ab chaos. Government is the order which you obey, like eating when you're hungry and covering yourself when you're cold, that servitude which I co-produce at the same time that I pursue my happiness, that I exercise my freedom of expression. Market freedom requires an active and extremely vigilant politics, explained one of the founders of neoliberalism. For the individual, monitored freedom is the only kind there is. This is what libertarians, in their infantilism, will never understand, and it's this incomprehension that makes the libertarian idiocy attractive to some hackers. A genuinely free being is not even said to be free. It simply is. It exists, deploys its powers according to its being. We say of an animal that it is en liberté, roaming free, only when it lives in an environment that's already completely controlled, fenced, civilized. In the park with human rules, where one indulges in a safari. Friend and free in English, and Freund and frei in German, come from the same Indo-European root, which conveys the idea of a shared power that grows. Being free and having ties was one and the same thing. I am free because I have ties, because I am linked to a reality greater than me. In ancient Rome, the children of citizens were liberi. Through them, it was Rome that was growing. Which goes to show how ridiculous and what a scam the individual freedom of I do what I feel like doing is. If they truly want to fight the government, the hackers have to give up this fetish. The cause of individual freedom is what prevents them from forming strong groups capable of laying down a real strategy, beyond a series of attacks. It's also what explains their inability to form ties beyond themselves, their incapacity for becoming a historical force. A member of Telecomics alerts his colleagues in these terms. What is certain is that the territory you're living in is defended by persons you would do well to meet, because they're changing the world and they won't wait for you. Another obstacle for the hacker movement, as every new meeting of the Chaos Computer Club demonstrates, is in managing to draw a front line in its own ranks between those working for a better government, or even the government, and those working for its destitution. The time has come for taking sides. It's this basic question that Julian Assange dodges when he says, "We high-tech workers are a class, and it's time we recognize ourselves as such." France has recently exploited the defect to the point of opening a university for molding quote-unquote ethical hackers. Under DCRI supervision, it will train people to fight against the real hackers, those who haven't abandoned the hacker ethic. These two problems merged in a case that strongly affected us. After so many attacks that so many of us applauded, anonymous/lulzsec hackers found themselves, like Jeremy Hammond, nearly alone facing repression upon getting arrested. On Christmas Day 2011, lulzsec defaced the site of Stratfor, a private intelligence multinational. By way of a homepage, there was now the scrolling text of the coming insurrection in English, and $70,000 was transferred from the accounts of Stratfor customers to a set of charitable associations, a Christmas present. And we weren't able to do anything, either before or after their arrest. Of course, it's safer to operate alone or in a small group, which obviously won't protect you from infiltrators when one goes after such targets. But it's disastrous for attacks that are so political and so clearly within the purview of global action by our party to be reduced by the police to some private crime, punishable by decades of prison or used as a lever for pressuring this or that internet pirate to turn into a government snitch.